for sending people up here who are saying enough is enough and we need to have, get our house in order.
Of course, nonetheless, there's all too little of this, and it's all noise unless you have the prescription for getting your house in order, when in fact there is one and one only order which can serve us.
Let's talk about the situation in the Koreas. You have a very interesting opinion about this. You've said, or you've hinted before, that the Korea conflict may have been orchestrated to boost the dollar. What do you mean by that? It's a pretty shocking claim, and one that we don't really hear very often.
Well, I don't know whether it's so directly as much as a repercussion. When these incidents occur, people rush to the dollar. But that's really just very temporary. But with my non-interventionist foreign policy, I just don't like to see a saber rattling by going over there with our ships and all.
If you caught that, that was supposed to answer the question of his assertion how this some Korean incident was fabricated as a manipulation of the dollar. And excuse me, but that kind of irrelevance is just scary.
The analogy I draw to this is, we have a problem on our Texas and U.S.-Mexican border. What if the interests of China, what if they thought it was in their interest and they had an alliance with Chavez in Venezuela? What if they had war games in the Gulf of Mexico? We'd be hysterical. But we think nothing of saying, well, there's a problem over there and we got to show them our might, and we're going to go over there and we're going to set all these rules and dictate what's going on in Korea. I think if we hadn't stayed in Korea, it would be one country right now. I sincerely believe that.
How, nonetheless, could that possibly explain a manipulation of the dollar?
Do you think that, what's going to happen with the situation? Is it going to escalate? I know they're trying to put pressure on China. Is China going to do anything? And if not, is the United States more likely to get involved? It's already bogged down.
We're way too much involved in China. China has a greater interest. I think we have a greater interest in what happens in Cuba than China should. So, that's in their neighborhood, and I think we should back away, and I think Japan and China, South Korea, they should decide what to do. I think China, as a matter of fact, I think South Korea is quite capable of taking care of themselves. But if we always say, no matter what happens, we're going to be there and we're going to fight your war for you, I think that encourages a lackadaisical attitude about resolving their differences.
However much we may or may not agree with his ideas of foreign policy, nonetheless, that absolutely fails to explain the monetary issues. Nonetheless, then, as this reaction to the Bernanke interview is the current rave of Ron Paul supporters, and yet, as there isn't even the slightest hint of monetary solution either here or elsewhere in the ever-vacant arithmetic of the Paul proposition. The preposterous thing is that thinking Ron Paul's ostensible opposition to the central bank only somehow represents an end to its disastrous consequences and perpetual injustices. Ron Paul has in fact garnered support from no more than the so unwary that they believe convening the same power to obfuscate our currency on all banks can possibly avert the injustices which are not ramifications of the purported Federal Reserve, but which instead are inevitable ramifications of the obfuscation of the currency, which is incumbent upon banking, the very banking and obfuscation of the currency which we must eradicate, and the very banking and obfuscation of the currency which Ron Paul and purported Austrian economics exist to preserve. Finally, in this program, I wanted to cover a recent development. Dennis Kucinich, in conjunction with a prominent plagiarist, has announced a rude imitation of our mandate for mathematically perfected economy, which he claims delivers just and sustainable economy, using my very words to falsely promote a purported alternate solution, preserving interest, and thus in definite conflict with my long-standing proof of singular solution. How can this be? First, some vital background. In answering this question, I think it's probably best if I just read excerpts of an email which I was forced to send to my own private email list in regard to an announcement of this issue. The Zarlinga-Kucinich alliance starts with Zarlinga. So Zarlinga first, who is the founder of the one-man purported American Monetary Institute, or AMI. Zarlinga casts himself into the 11th hour monetary reform pretenders some 30 years after my work proved a singular monetary solution, when in the later 90s he plagiarized my work in his rather preposterous Lost Science of Money. Zarlinga in fact soon contacted me after release of his imitation, asking me, of all people, to help promote his assumable pretended resurrection of a lost science, which never before existed, actually, at least in any historic record, declaring in his appeal to me that we are of like mind. In the wake of my immediate response to his appeal, Zarlinga refused to reply how, if he knew we are of like mind, in which case he would know my work long preceded his, how he could possibly claim to have resurrected a purportedly lost science of money, being as from its inception, he would have to know then that since 1968 to 79, my thesis of mathematically perfected economy was a proof of singular monetary solution. In the wake of his perpetual refusal to answer, we find what a pretended authority Mr. Zarlinga actually is. Of course, my proof of inevitable failure and singular solution has existed online since 10 years before the official Internet. In the documentation and computer models which I had provided the Reagan administration, with a further sustaining fact of the first development of such an actual science demonstrated in the fact my models projected then that the present failure would transpire at approximately 2010 AD. As my projections proved true, thousands of websites have plagiarized my work, as well as a host of other books, including Zarlinga's preposterous pretension to resurrect a lost science which never before existed, and which he knew at the time had already been developed in the very work he merely imitated, and quite poorly, as we would expect of a neophyte who didn't even fully understand what he merely imitated. Thus, his own work is a proof of no more than Zarlinga's corrupt motives, which are further proven by many events which have followed. As we see in the following, this person who had written me, Hero Kucinich, rejected a proposition of mathematically perfected economy in 2008, not only without refutation, but even without response or comment. In fact, then, contrary to this person who has written me, to their praise of heroism and courage in this bill by Kucinich and Zarlinga, in which they had conspired previously to cowardly evasion of a fact of singular solution, to no more betterment than to promote their names to the fore, in eventually submitting the bill which this person who had written me now proudly announces, which neither is solution. We'll cover the latter presently. Of course, at the same time, since the web became the web, every page of my site has indicated why and how mathematically perfected economy was a singular solution to the categoric faults of today's pretended economy. And my thesis of inevitable failure, too, is the very reason so many people now understand the ramifications of interest, which Mr. Zarlinga can't even articulate, which are a principal, but not the only reason, for imperative monetary reform, which reform can solve the categoric faults and injustices of the present imposed systems if and only if the reform is mathematically perfected economy. As we shall soon see, Zarlinga and Kucinich's trivialization of the causes which must be solved in a bona fide solution come far from solving the issues before us. In fact, Mr. Kucinich's presentation of the issues in the form of this bill, on the contrary, prove his and this person who's written me their ineptitude. The plagiarizations of Zarlinga, of course, come in the wake yet of many others. Jake Ryan likewise wrote me, in this case before plagiarizing my work, and quite stupidly, he blatantly exposes his plagiarizations in the first page of his purported debt virus, telling my parable of perfect economy as a real event, when in fact it is a story dating from 1975, which I constructed to teach mathematically perfected economy with an embedded fault. In his stupidity, Jake Rand exposes the fact of his plagiarization by telling the same story, somewhat changed in wording and account, as if it were an actual historic event, repeating the position of Franklin as my mere story gave Franklin to issue the words of Mike Montagne through the mouth of Mr. Franklin himself. So prolific is the plagiarism of my work now, then, that in fact, literally millions of web pages now wrongly attribute Franklin to have taught mathematically perfected economy. Thus, every such site exposes their blatant plagiarism, and the fact none attribute their source to be my pages, People for Mathematically Perfected Economy, further indicates that the culprits are even willfully attempting to conceal the fact they aren't the original authors of any of this. Likewise for Zarlinga, so it is important to know of these many and even ever proliferating transgressions if we are to understand and to put into perspective the work that these people are actually doing and the reasons which they are jumping into the fray as if they too are monetary authorities or actual authors of solution. Zarlinga, I am often told, isn't even so well thought of by many of his ostensible disciples, that, as they consider it, he isn't even a major factor among the plagiarists any longer. In my immediate response to Zarlinga's incredible appeal that I help him promote his plagiarism, anticipating this